Hi, and welcome to the next of our webinars under the Humber Business Growth Hub programme. First of all, just welcome everybody to today's session, and I want to just welcome and introduce Kate, who will be the presenter for today. Kate is from Humber HR People, and we'll be talking about hiring and onboarding remotely. Just to mention that this is delivered through Humber Business Growth Hub through the Grow My SME programme. And is a fully funded program via the Growth Hub. Just a couple of things I want to talk about, just a couple of housekeeping points here. First of all, we do encourage as many questions as we can. We're here to try and answer as many questions as we can. So you will see a little question function on your dashboard. If you do have any questions, please put it in there. What I would suggest is put it in as soon as you come up with the question. And we'll come to these at the end. We have got time built into today's session to go through any questions that people may have. So put them in and we'll come to them at the end. The second one is just about breaks. There is a break sort of scheduled in during today's session just to go and get a cup of coffee, etc. So we do hope we'll have those breaks and they will come through about halfway, third of the way through, something like that. So without further ado, I will pass you on to Kate, who will take over and talk about hiring and onboarding remotely. Thank you, Kate.
Thanks very much, Peter. Good afternoon, everyone. This is the first time I've done a webinar where I can't see you all, so I'm hoping you can see me, and I'm going to do my best to give you hopefully some tips and tricks and some value this afternoon. Just to introduce myself, my name is Kate van der Sluis. I'm Dutch by marriage, not by birth, as you can tell by the accent. I've worked in recruitment for about 20 years, makes me sound very old, but that's across Yorkshire and Manchester, and I've worked with businesses from startup, from their first member of staff, right through to global PLCs as well. So I've seen quite a bit in terms of hiring, and some of that I'm going to include today, but of course the world has changed, and it's changed beyond belief, which is why I'm standing in my home office here presenting to you this afternoon. So we tried to put together a session for you to really help, perhaps in a rebuild situation, coming out of COVID, thinking about how do we start to find employees that we might need again in that recovery situation. So that's what we're going to focus on in today's webinar. In terms of timing, got about 40 minutes. I would have loved to have made this interactive, but of course it's not possible over a webinar. But as Peter's just said, I'd really welcome questions. I'm very open to responding to your individual challenges around hiring and onboarding remotely. So if you pop those in the chat, we will come to them at the end and hopefully have some good ideas for you personally. So that's how that's going to work. I've also included some extra material under this topic because there are some things that never change in terms of hiring and onboarding, and so I've included some of those good practice stuff as well. My understanding from Peter is that we're able to send out post this webinar a pack to you of links and some of the information that we'll go through. So hopefully some of that will be referenced at the end as well. I think that's pretty much everything. I should say, and I normally say Chatham House rules, but of course, again, I'm presenting to you, so we won't worry about that too much today. But certainly I'd welcome any questions at all at the end, even if they seem stupid to you. So let's crack on then and let's start having a look at this topic. The first piece I want to look at, forgive me, make the tech work. So as I said, what we're going to cover then, just to give you that overview again, we're going to look at regional, national and global talent pools, because if we're thinking about hiring, we need to think about where the people are that we want to hire. We're going to have a little look at some recruitment processes that really work, that the ones that actually result in the right person joining your business. We're going to have a little look at remote working, which is probably the hottest topic in today's webinar. Things changing daily, and certainly as of 2 days ago, something that I think is really going to revolutionise how we work. And we're going to also have a look at onboarding. Some extras towards the end would be things like keeping it legal, so just being mindful of UK employment law, in particular what the pieces of employment law that relate to hiring, and a little bit in there about diversity and inclusion if we get to it. And again, all this will be referenced. Let's dive straight in and have a look at talent pools. Just before we do, there's just a reminder here and a quote that I quite like. Hiring is about finding the right people for your team and your business. It's not about finding the best people. And that's quite a subtle distinction, but it's a really important one. because sometimes the best available person in the market isn't the best person for your team. So I think we just need to be mindful of that at the outset when you're thinking about bringing people on board. And what I mean by that really is you hire, as most have experienced if you've ever been in a recruitment process, we hire on skills and we hire on experience, but we also really need to hire on attitude. And we'll look in a few slides' time at how we do that remotely. So I wanted to have a look at the region that we're in. This is the Humber LEP, so let's have a look at the Humber, and then we're going to look at the wider talent pool. So the Humber on the map there, you can see on the right is the area outlined. Obviously, it's quite a varied area. It's big geographically, small in terms of population. So we've got quite a few challenges. Just to set out for you what that looks like in terms of the numbers. And as a guess, I wondered how many people of you know. There are about 1 million people, 925,000 people live in the Humber. Of those, about half are of working age. And then as of September 2019, obviously things have changed a little since these figures were put out. We have a very, very high percentage of employment in the Humber, so 94.2%. That means that the great unemployed pool that's perhaps sometimes thought of in terms of, you know, the Daily Mail and things like that, it isn't as big as you think. It's about 25,000 people are actually unemployed that want a job. So your talent pool, if you're looking within the region, is very likely to already be in a job. So that's just something to be mindful of. We have got inward migration. It is worth pointing out that certainly Hull as the city region is still growing. So since 2005, the population's been slowly increasing, which is a good thing as a place to live and work. But we will see, of course, what direction Brexit takes us in terms of inward migration, and we'll come back to that too. Just to move on then in terms of the region, and I'm hoping this pace is okay for everybody. If it's too fast, please let me know in the chat. So a summary of our regional labour market for you. It's a highly contained labour market. So most people that live and work in the region live and work in the region. We have very little inward and outward migration in terms of jobs. So we're very vulnerable to any economic shocks. And you're seeing some of that perhaps in your daily working lives at the moment. Our working age population is below average. So we haven't got as many people. And it's an ageing workforce as well. Productivity, unfortunately, is not great in our region either. And something that's a real opportunity, that fourth point there, underemployment is very high. So what do I mean by underemployment? So underemployment would be a situation where somebody is perhaps qualified or would like a job at a higher pay grade than they're currently on. So that could include graduates working perhaps as baristas, part-timers who are fully qualified in the professions, who can't find a role that fits with them. We've got a real opportunity in that space. We've got the recent shift away from traditional industries, whether we're North or South Bank in the Humber, to higher skilled roles. So that includes higher skilled in manufacturing, in renewables and offshore, and also in areas like tech. So we're shifting away from that demographic of relatively low level unskilled roles into higher skilled roles. And that demand is huge for our region. So about 60,000 more people needed. It's a big number. And that last point there, of course, Brexit. Sorry to say the B word twice in the first two slides, but there is already the impact there, and a further predicted impact of migrant workers. And obviously that's hit the production industries first, but I think we need to be mindful of what might happen going forward. It hasn't gone away despite the pandemic, I'm afraid. So that's sort of just to give you an idea of the landscape in which we might be hiring at the minute. Moving on to that, I'm just going to finish off on Brexit really, but we know already that the dip in EU citizens coming into the UK is going to be a threat. Seasonal work is a particular threat in agriculture and a lot of the businesses that we work with from time to time in the food industry. And I think it's really interesting if you are a business or you're somebody who's interested in terms of that particular population of workers. The latest UK immigration points has just come out, and there's a link to it on this slide which we can include in the pack. It's just a really interesting moving landscape, and it's not easy to navigate. So I think it's something that's well worth a good read if that's going to impact you and your hiring plans. So that was quite a lot of stats and quite a lot of numbers, wasn't it? And what I'm keen to do is kind of bring it to life a bit. So I think I'd like to introduce a subject on this slide. This is a concept, a subject called degrees of separation. And some of you might have heard of this. There's a good sort of urban myth around a guy called Kevin Bacon, if anyone knows him. So he's a bit of a celebrity, and here we talk about 6 degrees from Kevin Bacon. So this idea of degrees of separation is how far you're connected with everybody else on the planet. So not in our region, but on the planet. And I need to read this to you because I think it's quite interesting. So the idea was coined a number of years ago that all people are 6 or fewer degrees of separation from everybody else. So just like those circles on the image you can see in front of you. So for each person in the world, 1.59 people active on Facebook, to give you an idea, is connected to every other person on Facebook by an average of 3. So because of social media, it used to be 6, it's now 3. So there's an average distance, there's quite a lot of studies behind this. Again, I can reference these for you. But according to the latest study of 5.2 billion relationships on social media, the average distance between people online is 4.67. So we're really not the remote place that perhaps our region suggests it to be. And the reason for that is probably technology. So if we're going to say that globally we are 4.67 degrees away from each other, then how many degrees of separation might it be within our region? Why on earth am I banging on about this in a webinar about hiring? Well, the reason for that is reputation is everything. And whatever you do within your hiring process, everybody else, assume that everybody else is going to find out about it and everyone else is going to know. So let's say, for example, you're a growing business in an engineering sector and you need to hire highly skilled 3D CAD designers, for example. Those people are very likely to have studied together. They're very likely to know each other. They might be part of the same professional association. They may well be connected socially as well. In essence, anything you do within a hiring process is going to get out there. So reputation becomes really, really important when you consider this idea of degrees of separation. So before I talk about any sort of hiring process or any hints or tips or tricks, I think it's really important to understand the region that you're trying to achieve this in and the fact that your reputation is on the line in every single communication you put out there. So just be really mindful of it. So moving on from that, I'm not trying to scare everyone. There are some opportunities to be had. So let's talk about remote hiring because this has changed significantly in the last couple of months. So remote working then, because if we're remote hiring, we must by definition perhaps be remote working as well. This is, in my opinion, the single biggest change to the workplace in decades. And it's a huge political and ideological and ethical debate around what does remote working mean as an individual, for productivity, for businesses, for workplaces, for offices. And I think it's only just started really. The official government guidance, as we stand today in July, is that reasonable steps should be taken so that anyone who can work from home does at the moment. Now that's in a pandemic. Let me look at what's the changing landscape of that from a central government point of view, and we look at Matt Hancock's sort of quite leading statements really in recent interviews. So just 3 days ago, Matt has stated that he thinks it should be the norm where possible, and that we need to persuade people that allowing flexible working should continue and that it's a change that's never going to go away. And he's also called for a fairly major study to be done into the efficiency, I took that to mean productivity, of remote working. There's a lot to come on that, and we're going to keep touching on it. And the reason we're touching on it now is because we've talked already about this tiny pool of people, if you're looking to hire people who can physically get to your place of work, versus a much, much larger pool. So I just wanted to throw that in there today because I think it's really relevant, and probably more so given the last couple of days and some of the movements that the government is making. There's some real opportunities in here for small business, and we'll go on to show you why. So I wanted to share with you a business case if I can. So if I was in a room talking perhaps to an MD or somebody who headed up a business, and why would I be suggesting that we don't just recruit from people who can commute to our office or get to us every day unless the role demands it, and I don't take away any roles that need that. But there is a business case for some roles, and global mobility is increasingly viewed as a way to get hold of great people, and it's not just for the big corporates. So if this pandemic has taught UK PLC anything, it's that remote working can work for a huge percentage of roles. Not all, and not all the time, but enough to consider remote working as a real long-term option for some. And add into that we then start thinking not just about EU-based talent, referencing back to Brexit, but to widen the net right out to recruit skilled workers from countries across the world, across Asia, across Africa, and across other parts of the world as well. And some of the trends that sit behind that, of course, are things like the gig economy, workers who have essentially freelancers, who have various contracts, perhaps simultaneous contracts with different employers. There is a huge report called The Future World of Work, which, if you're interested in this like I am, because I'm a bit geeky, point towards an increasingly agile and global workforce, and it's all enabled through the type of technology that we're using today. So I suppose if we round that up and think about what is our talent pool, well, actually it could be anywhere. And there are, this isn't a remote working webinar, but there are those considerations, because if you're hiring, what job are you hiring into and where are people going to be based? So a few considerations, the key points there, thinking about if we're hiring and we're looking for someone to work remotely, then what are the essentials that we need to consider? So remote management is a skill that can be learned. It is very different to managing people in an office environment or in a factory environment or face-to-face. A lot of it involves coaching, because you can't tell somebody what to do if you're not there all the time. So it's perhaps moving culturally away from an autocratic culture, more towards one that's about enabling and encouraging people to achieve what they need to achieve, but to take responsibility and to have accountability for that. Obviously, you've probably seen a lot around, I know we've done some webinars as part of this program around mental health, around well-being, particularly loneliness when it comes to remote working. And that's one of the things that perhaps needs to be considered in terms of how do you keep remote workers engaged, how do you keep them in touch with their colleagues, and how do you replace the bits around the edges that make work a nice place to be. So the conversations at the water cooler, the coffee at lunchtime, those sorts of things. Obviously, as an employer, we've also got a duty of care. So health and safety for home workplaces is a consideration, making sure that people have got appropriate place to work, it's quiet, all those essential things that you need. And I speak as a mum too, his kids are homeschooling, so I absolutely feel that. The investment in technology to enable remote working, of course, might fall under some nice tax credits for small businesses at the minute. So there's a lot out there for R&D that I know the advisors on the Humber programme can help you with. So if you are investing in technology to enable people to work remotely and it falls under that R&D, then it may well be that you can get some support with that. You can offset perhaps also some remote working with cost savings on office space. Most of the studies that I've read in the last couple of days in preparation for this have pointed towards employees' preference to be a blended approach. So extremes at either end. Some people want to be in the office all the time, some people want to be on site all the time, there are others that want to be at home all the time, but the vast majority from all the surveys that I've been reading say that people would prefer a blended approach, certainly prefer some contact face-to-face with their workmates. Can work either way, but that's what most people seem to prefer. So moving on from remote working, let's dive into the subject you're actually here for. I really wanted to give you a case study. There's a reference here, and there is a video on this link, which I was going to play, but I know the sound isn't so great. So rather than offending your ears with inferior sound, I wanted to tell you a story about a business that we're involved with via a colleague of mine, Alison. Tyke are a London-based business, but the reason I know them so well is their HR manager is 100% remote. So she works and lives up here in the Humber. And Tyke are quite unique because actually most of their workforce is remote. So 99% of them are remote. They've got 72 employees around the world. They've proved it works for their business. They do have engineers within their team. I understand this isn't a blue collar role, it's white collar. But I think if you look at how a business in this arena can do it, it can be adapted. These guys are doing really well. They've got incredibly high levels of employee engagement. They are hiring very difficult to find developers, and they're doing it well because they can offer remote. Financially, they're doing very well. They're one to watch. So they've raised 4.5 million in funding in the last 12 months, and their revenue growth has gone from 190 to 4.2 million in a space of 3 years. So it's really one of those companies that I would highlight as one to look at and one to think about. They've got their own YouTube channel. That's where I stole this video from. So if you want to look a little bit about how a completely remote workplace functions, I'd suggest having a look at Tyke as a good example. So good story there. Yeah, because I know I don't want to offend your ears. I wanted to bring it down to a local region. So one of the other stories that I want to share is really what remote hiring looks like in our region. There are currently, as we speak, over 100 jobs advertised online in the last 3 days for Hull and the phrase remote working. And these, I was quite surprised looking at this. It wasn't the usual roles I expected. It wasn't franchise opportunities, purely telemarketing, that sort of thing. What's advertised actually is professional roles. So doctors, social workers, marketeers, import clerks, developers, and some examples there on the image that you can see. So I'd like to suggest that the idea of remote working, not just remote hiring, is potentially the start of a new way of businesses in the Humber to access talent and talent pools that they might need. If you're not already doing this within your organisation, I think it would be a really good idea to sit and work out which of the roles within your organisation could potentially be worked remotely if you're looking at hiring plan, looking at growth. So I'm just going to move on from that. I think I'm going a bit fast here, Peter. You might have to tell me the time in a minute. I just wanted to give you some summaries around this idea of this recruitment landscape, this hiring landscape that we're in. So the first is, and I know I would say this, but recruitment in this marketplace is still tough. So I would be tempted to see it as a separate and a distinct business function. So even if it's part of somebody's job, I think there's a really strong case to say a business cannot grow and evolve. So even if you're a well-established business with a number of people in roles for a long time, you might then be looking at the opposite problem, of course, of people retiring and looking at succession plans. So there's a really strong business case for investment around this. It doesn't mean outsourcing it necessarily, but I think it does mean understanding what your business needs in terms of hiring, because demand is only going to increase in the medium to long term, as you've seen on those slides around the migration to highly skilled workers. So it is going to get tougher, particularly if you're looking for those by highly skilled, I really mean sort of the national qualifications at level 5 and above. Really, really tough and will remain tough. So that's my my business case for thinking of it as a separate business function. The second point there, most people know this, but just to underline it, a bad hire costs you dear. A bad apple will impact everyone that works with that individual in terms of lost productivity, not just the cost of hire, but the indirect cost of having the right person, not having the right person on the books. So I think a great phrase to remember whenever you're doing hiring is, please do hire for the skills and experience you need, but you need to hire for attitude as well. You can generally train skills. You can certainly coach skills as well. You can give people experience, but you can't give someone attitude. So really, I think that's one of the key parts of any recruiter's recruitment process, is to make sure that you've identified what is it that makes your business unique, what is it that makes your team unique, what are those things that you'd be looking for somebody to be right for your team. And I'm going to come on to that in the second part of this webinar. The third point on this slide then is that the average number of years in a job is dropping. So the long gone are the days of a job for life, as most of us know. But actually, if we are able to get our heads around that as businesses, that could be a real advantage. So if you make an assumption that everyone in your organisation is probably going to have between 3 and 5 years tenure within your company, that's it. Then embrace that and accept it as a way to manage your talent pool and as a way to really leverage in the opportunities that brings. And then the very last point in there, it's coming back to that idea of remote and flexible working. So whether it's 75 or 50, even 20% 5% of the time on site, that's got some really exciting options to be able to hire within the UK, within the North, because if someone's only got to come to your site 1 day a week, then they may well live a good hour away, if not more. And if you're able to offer 100% remote, then actually you've now got a global talent pool and the world's your oyster. So I would definitely encourage businesses to think big, that hiring globally is not just for the corporates anymore, and technology enables us to do that. So I completely lost track of time. I'm just going to check in with Peter where we're at with things. How are we doing time-wise?
We're fine for time, no problems at all there.
Okay. I think about halfway.
About half an hour in we are now, so yeah.
Okay, brilliant, thank you. Well, I said 40 minutes, so we'll do a few more pieces and then we'll have a break. Okay, so we've had a look then at the recruitment landscape and a bit about talent pools and a bit about perhaps where we're looking for people. Let's move on and look at the actual process itself, which in the last few months, of course, has changed completely. So the key thing about recruitment processes is that they are actually really simple. It's not rocket science to do hiring. The problem, of course, is that if you don't follow a process, the devil's in the detail. So often, it seems simple, as you can see on this slide. We decide if we want to replace somebody, we perhaps produce a job description, we decide about an interview, we might go out to an agency or decide on a hiring strategy, and then we go through a process and, hey presto, we found the person. But I won't be the only person on this webinar to have stories that make your hair curl about how this process can go wrong. And I think now we've got to be doubly mindful of this because we're in a remote environment. So one of the key things that over the years that I've delivered when I've delivered hiring and recruitment training has been the concept of a moment of truth. I always liken hiring to dating, which might make you smile, but if you consider for a moment, if you're hiring someone full time, you are going to be living with this person for a lot of hours of your life. And so I don't actually think it's that different. So a moment of truth in a recruitment process, in a hiring process, is a moment when the deal can be made or broken. And there are lots of these actually in that process that we saw on the previous slide. So just to give you some examples, I've written down 1 or 2 here, but in my experience, things go wrong typically at 1 or 2 stages. So just trying to think about my experience of being a hiring manager, but also being hired myself. So what are the points when a hiring process gets stopped in its tracks? Well, one of the first ones I would say is the first conversation you have with somebody. Not in terms of first impressions count, but actually in terms of the quality of information that you gather the first time you have that conversation. That's usually over the phone. Sometimes it's face-to-face straight away. But as I said, the devil's in the detail. So often things go wrong because the first conversation didn't gather some essential intelligence about whether that individual is going to fit the role that you've got in mind. Sometimes, more often than not, it's salary. So don't be afraid to talk about salary early and especially remotely. I think we've got to have well-planned conversations, and I'm going to talk in a minute about this essential first part of the recruitment process. There's also the idea of pre-screening and of referencing. If you're going to meet somebody for the first time and take them through a 3-stage interview process or more, and then it falls down at the end because actually it turns out they're not as qualified as perhaps you thought they were or assumed they were, or the references you assumed would be available aren't available and you can't hire them anyway, or the professional membership has lapsed where actually you assumed that it was up to date. So there are some things, again, that happen right at the beginning that can really waste your time and everyone's time that's involved in the process. The other moment of truth that I see often, particularly with SMEs, is that we hire on skills and experience or because somebody seems right for the role, rather than really thinking about and doing due diligence around whether this person is culturally right for your team. And that is a tough gig for the first time you do it. It does get easier, but really it's about identifying what the key behaviours are in your organisation that make your best employees the best employees, because you'll want more of that. So I think if you've been able to identify, write down and include that, then you'll be able to identify that much earlier in the recruitment process. And again, you won't end a situation where, and I've sat on the recruitment boards before, where you've perhaps got 2, 3, 4 candidates, and it seems confusing because it seems like they can all do the job, and of course they can, but who's right? And it's much easier if you've defined that much earlier on in the process. So this idea of moments of truth, all of those moments of truth, all of those risks of it going wrong are increased because we now have to do all of this remotely. So again, the devil's in the detail, and I would suggest that actually everything that follows this, in terms of what good hiring looks like, if you take all of these tips and multiply them by 10, that's probably where we need to be at the moment to ensure that you get the right people. One of the questions I was asked when I was putting this together was, is it possible to hire remotely? And the answer is a resounding yes, of course you can. It's just different, and it feels different, and probably feels a bit scary, but it's perfectly possible, and Tyke is a good example of that. It's what they do all the time. There's another organisation in Hull City Centre that some of you might have heard of called APD Communications, and I know that between lockdown, 24th of March, and now they've actually hired 30 people, 30 people in that period of time. So again, another example of absolutely you can hire remotely. So I'm just going to move on to what are the key things that we need to do well then. So good practice in recruitment. Some of this might feel a little bit uncomfortable if you've not done it in this order before, but I'll explain why. So essentially there are 3 good strands in my experience to doing great hiring. So the first one is make it really easy to apply. And that's the one that most people go, sorry. I'll explain my thinking, but make it really, really easy to apply. And then make it really tough to get in. So the analogy I'm going to use for that one is a nightclub, and I'll show you why in a minute. And the last one is coming back to that piece about degrees of separation, which is that reputation is everything, even for the candidates you don't want. So every touch point that any potential employee has with your organisation and your representatives, so let's not forget here, if you outsource your hiring to a third party, every touch point they have with that third party reflects back on your organisation. So that will influence not just their decision to apply and their decision to consider being your employee, but it's also potentially going to influence their network, and it's a small network. So what really job seekers are looking for is to engage with you from the very first the very first conversation. And if your advert is a little bit off, if it's not consistent perhaps with your brand, if the agency they liaise with is a bit rude, if the process isn't timely, if the follow-up process doesn't make sense, if it's not well thought through, it doesn't really matter how much money you throw at this. It's gonna fall over, because those basics will influence the candidate's decision whether to join you or not. So it's just worth knowing that. And again, small networks, most good candidates do know most other people, particularly if you're in a niche sector. People study together, they know each other. So I'm going to move on to the idea of making it easy to apply, and I've got quite a lot of examples on this, so really welcome any comments in the chat about this next slide. The idea here is application forms and CVs are not the only way to hire. In fact, I'd argue that they're one of the worst ways to hire, and I'm sure you've heard that before. But you don't have to have an expensive recruitment process. You can re-engineer this process yourself and make it right for your organisation and for the role that you're looking to hire. So I've said before, make it easy. I also think it needs to be relevant. And I've got quite a lot of examples. I had a brain dump this morning, and some of them are a bit off the wall, but I'll share them with you, and use the right channels. So if we think outside the box, I ran a session like this as a workshop not so long ago, and within there was a HR manager looking to hire welders. I forget whether it's MIG or TIG welders, and some of you might know the difference, I don't. But in any case, she needed welders. And the process the company had always followed was to ask for a CV, which is fine until you're a welder. There aren't many welders that have CVs, and I'd suggested to her that perhaps that was a barrier to potentially a very good welder working for her business. So we threw this idea around a bit, and in the end we came up with the idea that actually welders don't need a CV. What welders do need in a recruitment process is to demonstrate that they know how to weld really well. that they know how to do that within health and safety, that they know how to use the right mix in the canisters, that they know how to get on and do a job without much instruction, if that's what you're looking for. So actually her recruitment process at the end of this was they were going to have an open session for any experienced welders to come and do a project in their factory, and from there they would pick somebody to then have a conversation with and potentially hire. So there's lots of these. If you think about expressions of interest as a phrase rather than apply with a CV for a moment, if you want a qualified person, let's say I'm hiring for a qualified marine pilot, and if that's absolutely essential for my role, the first thing I might do is put out a really brief call on social media or on my website or via an agency and say, could anyone who's a qualified marine pilot please send me your certificate? Send me proof of your qualification, please. That's all I need right now. Because you've now got a stack of people who are qualified to do the role, and now you can take it through. So you've made it really easy for those people to apply. Some other examples might be, if it's someone on LinkedIn, don't ask them to send me your CV. Just ask them to download their PDF, which is really easy to do. It's just underneath their profile, and forward you their profile. So don't ask them to produce a 3-page document. It will take time. If they're good and they're in employment, they probably haven't got the time, or worse still, they'll give it to a professional CV writer and then you're not looking at their work anyway. So just get them to forward you them the LinkedIn profile. If you are looking for a technical lead in a technology business or in an engineering firm, then why don't you tell them to write you an email with the latest project that they led on and tell you about it? That's all you need. You will get a gist from that email whether that person can communicate, whether they led on the right type of project, what the outcome was. You don't need their CV at that stage, you just need to qualify them. There's some others that I came up with. What about a service desk analyst? These guys who, you know, when my computer goes wrong and I ring my IT company and someone takes my call. So with a service desk analyst, really I'd want to know how they take the call. So the application process would be perhaps over the phone, and it might ask them to describe a typical customer that they dealt with yesterday. And again, I don't need their CV. It's the first thing I do. I'd like to speak to any third-party service analysts who are interested in a role. Please send me your phone number, have a conversation. Salespeople. The one I always use for salespeople, which works really well, is a common complaint for salespeople is that they don't follow up. People don't, you know, it's that see you for 10 minutes and off I go. Not a great sales strategy. So for salespeople, ask them to ring you within a certain time frame. I'm looking for the best salesperson in Hull. Could you please ring me on Wednesday between 2 and 4 o'clock? See how many ring you. Because A, they've got the gumption to pick up the phone, they can follow an instruction, and they can ring you at the right time. Great, that's the starting point of a good salesperson. What else have we got? So an accountant. Proof of qualification maybe, but actually a good accountant in business is there to save money. So when was the last time that you managed to achieve a significant cost saving for your current employer? Because maybe that's what I'm looking for. So I've got loads of examples, and maybe some of these are a little bit off the wall, and actually this might be a new idea for some of you. What I'm saying is make it really easy for the people to apply, because you can filter down this list later, but if you want choice, you've got to make it easy. So the other one actually is customer service, before I forget. If someone is in a customer service role, any sort of client-facing role, ask them to send you their testimonials, their latest customer feedback, because you want somebody really good at it. So you won't need anything else until the second stage. Okay, so that's the idea of making it really easy to apply. There's plenty of technology to enable you to do those things. You could use Dropbox to ask people to drop information to you. You could use good old email. You certainly don't need a 3-page history of what that person's done. And I'll touch on more on that just later on when we talk about interviews. I think we might be coming up to 40 minutes. So I'm going to do perhaps 2 more slides and then we can have a break. Okay, so we've made it really easy to apply. The next thing is to make it really tough to get in. So it's almost the opposite. So I've now gathered together a crowd of potential people, because I've made it really easy for people to get in touch and tell me they might be interested in potentially working together, which is great. It's like a nightclub. I've gathered a crowd around the nightclub and everyone wants to get in. That's brilliant, because now I'm popular and all those good things. What I'm now going to do is act as a bouncer in the nightclub, and if your name's not down, you ain't coming in. So this is where it gets much tougher. And this, I think, is one of the things in recruitment that perhaps hiring managers who've not hired much before or only did it once in a blue moon are most scared of. This is the bit where you get to be the gatekeeper, and actually you are paid to be the gatekeeper. If you own your own business or work for one, your job is to filter out the very best person at this stage to ready to go into a proper sort of recruitment due diligence process. And it's really fast, and it feels, when you first do it, very harsh, but you'll get good at this. So it's called a pre-screening process. Anyone who's in professional recruitment will tell you about this as well. It's personal, it's on the phone, it's fast, and you need to make an instant decision. And I'm quite happy for people to disagree on this. If you've ever worked in the public sector, this would be completely alien to that. But my argument is this comes later in the process, and actually if this bit isn't right, you've wasted your time anyway. So a pre-screening process for me is having a good conversation around the key things you're looking for and be really mindful of what you're looking for. So how does it actually work? Well, this is how it works in terms of good practice. So it's going to be quick, it's going to be personal, it's going to be really effective. It is a skill, and it involves active listening, not just to what someone says, but how they say it, their tone of voice, their language, all those clues that you get, even over a Zoom like today, or over the phone, FaceTime or WhatsApp or however you use it, all those little clues that tell you whether someone's going to be a good match for your organisation. And they will be there, but you just need to look out for them. So how do we approach it? Well, we would be very welcoming, approachable, accessible. Think of meeting an acquaintance for the first time. This is potentially someone you're going to spend a good chunk of your working life with. You know, you need next teammates, so we approach it in that way. And we make it fairly structured. And structure is a really important thing to consider when we're doing remote hiring, because actually structure, going back to what I said before, structure is doubly important when you're doing this remotely, because without it, you can sort of lose your way a little bit. So it's scheduled in the diary, this pre-screen. I've received an expression of interest from somebody who's interested in a role, and the next point is to talk to them in more detail if you've already spoken to them once, or for the first time if you've asked them to send you something, whether that's a CV, a portfolio, or an example of the work they've done. So you schedule it in your diary, a couple of days notice, no more than that, and you need to be really flexible. If you're looking for someone who have got in-demand skills, you may well have to do this out of hours, Saturdays, Sundays, and so on. It's worth doing if they're the right person. Introduction, really simple and straightforward. Calling to say thank you for your interest. I just want to go through a few questions with you, probably take 5, 10, 15 minutes tops, and really help me to understand what you're looking for and whether the role I've got is a potential fit for you. Is that all right? So it's really straightforward. You're very much setting out the reason for that conversation. When I do this as a workshop, I actually give people practice in doing this, because, as I said, it does feel very strange when you first do it, but actually, again, when you're hiring remotely, it's going to be pretty important to get this bit right. This is one of the moments of truth in a process, and if you don't do this, you're more likely to end up with no result at the end for all your hard-won time and effort in seeing all these people. I'm going to move on from that to take a breath. I feel like I'm going a little bit fast. Okay, just to finish off before we take a break then, at the end of this pre-screen, the key thing really is to go back to this idea that reputation is everything. So pre-screening is a skill, but if you get it right, you will narrow down your pool of people outside the nightclub door very quickly to the VIPs who you really want to have in-depth conversations and interviews with. But for all the others, it's really important to feedback. Templates are fine, email templates are fine. I've been asked that before. I don't see any reason why a well-worded email, shouldn't work. I would add a line or two, make it personal, because it's always appreciated. We all know when we get an automated email, dear sir, dear mister. Take your time, no matter how, even the ones that are a complete mismatch for your organisation or for you, just wish them well. Wish them well in their job search. If, on the other hand, you feel it's someone who you like, but they're not right for the vacancy you've got now, a simple thing, but it'll save you a fortune, is start building yourself a talent pool. That sounds like quite a big, strategic thing to do, but actually it's really simple, as many of you know already. Remember to build your list. And my experience has been that most businesses know that this is a good idea, but they don't actually do it. It can be as simple as an Excel spreadsheet. So just ask permission to keep their details on file. If you feel that the attitude's there, but the skills and experience aren't quite, keep in touch with them. And that's, again, part of that recruitment being a separate business function, because it may well be that you want to put a process in for your talent pool, your spreadsheet, that you drop those individuals a line perhaps once a quarter if you're fast growing, or once a year, or once every 6 months, just to say, I've still got your details, this is where we're at as a business, can you let me know if you're still happy for us to talk? You never know where they're going to go, what all that time that you're keeping in touch, and it's a very strategic way of building out your team. On the other hand, if you feel that they're really not right for you, please take time to point them in the right direction. The Humber in particular launched a brilliant scheme not long ago. Forgive me, I'm just trying to remember the name of the portal, and I will put it in the chat as soon as I've remembered. But there are portals that you can refer people to that aren't Job Centre, where they can look perhaps for another role. You could refer them to a recruiter you've used. You could refer them to careers guidance if they need that. There are, various places where you can just be nice and help them a little bit, and they will remember that. Feedback wise, keep it professional, keep it personal, keep it honest. If somebody isn't right for you, please tell them. And that's the single biggest feedback we get from candidate experience, is that they don't hear, and they certainly don't hear within the time scale. So just bite the bullet and give them that feedback. You don't have to be harsh, but you do need to be honest, and if they're not right, please tell them, and tell them as soon as you can, once you've made up your mind. So I think that covers off sort of the beginning of a remote hiring process, hopefully, and gives you some ideas around where you might start, and some of the ideas and pitfalls to avoid those moments of truth. The last slide I'm going to finish on before we go for a bit of a break is just those top tips. So if you've gone through a pre-screen process and you're now at a point where you want to actually meet the person to go through their CV and really dig deep on their experience and their skills, because you think they're right already, because they've already proved, perhaps they've sent you something to say they could do the job, you've done a pre-screen, they're making all the right noises, they sound like they could be, pretty good, then naturally you need them to go to an interview situation. And most of us have had experience, I'm sure lots of experience by now, of using webinars and Zoom and Teams and Skype and goodness knows what else. So of course, all the technology's there. The tips that we would generally put out there, if you haven't done interviews online before, are here. So definitely schedule more time than you need to make the tech work. If you want to talk to somebody for 40 minutes, please put an hour in your diary. Good practice anyway with interviews, because if you find the right person, you may well find that you keep talking, and the last thing you want to do is cut a good conversation short. Do be flexible about platforms. There are lots of organisations that can't use Zoom for various reasons, but likewise there are candidates that won't want to use it because they don't have it downloaded. So make it easy for them and give them some options. If you're working with perhaps trying to find people who are at lower skill levels, they may well not have a laptop at home. So I think be mindful of that as well. You could always use FaceTime, you could use WhatsApp calling. Have a lot of questions ready, more than you need. So I would say probably a third more questions, because you need to keep it interactive and keep it moving, and it's not as natural. I've seen a lot of remote interviews where it's just you said, I said, and it's sort of a tag team, a ping pong conversation. Gets a bit dull. So I'd also suggest have something to hand that you can perhaps share on a screen share, or something that you've sent them beforehand on an email so that they've seen it. So have like an information exchange of perhaps a document or a portfolio or a business plan, or even a little screenshot of the workplace, so that you can share that at this stage and say, well, actually, we were talking about this new production line, here it is. So something that creates energy and interest and kind of stops that ping pong so much. Definitely use the screen split function as well. So if you are interviewing somebody over any of these on a laptop, then it's really quite simple to have a screen split and put either their CV or their LinkedIn profile, or, side by side, so that you can refer to it as you go along. And the last thing is, if you're looking at recording an interview, which obviously is much easier now that we're on remote platforms, and you may well want to do that to refer back to it or to share it with colleagues, then just ask for permission and make sure you've got permission beforehand. but that can be a really good way of showing colleagues who you've met. So I'm going to take a bit of a break there, I think, Peter, if that's okay.
Yes, sounds a good place to have a break. Certainly some really good information there.
I'm afraid I can't hear you very well, Peter, but I'm assuming that you're saying we're taking a break, which is good.
Certainly I'm going to say making things easy is one of the things that I'm certainly going to take away from this one. Yes, yeah. No problems. Yeah, so if we have a bit of a break now, if we have 10 minutes break, so that will take us to 3:05, if that's okay for everybody. So if we come back and we'll restart at 3:05. Thank you very much.
Fabulous, thank you. See you soon. Can you still hear me, Peter?
I can do, yes.
Okay, just checking. Sorry, I thought I'd broken it. Okay, I'll be back in a couple of minutes. Thanks.
Okay, you're off the slides at the moment onto.
Okay.
Yes.
I flip them back on. Is that right?
Great.
Yeah, thanks. Hi there, Peter.
Hi.
Hi. Sorry, I'm just checking it's working again.
Yeah, all working.
Are we nearly ready to go with the second half, do you think?
Yeah, I'll let you just when you're ready to carry on.
No problem. I think most people are back online, so I'm just conscious of making sure that we sit within the timescales. So I think we'll just recap on that last piece, just to go over it again, just to give you that kind of key piece around hiring, really. So going back to the point about moments of truth, then the idea is the devil's in the detail. There are a couple of points within a process where it can go really wrong. Typically, first conversation about money, and conversation at the end, so the offer. That's when it can go wrong and waste an awful lot of time. So I think it's about being mindful of those points when it potential danger points in a process. Really, none of them are difficult. It's just that perhaps the right questions need to be asked at those stages. I'd argue the most important of those is the pre-screen. So we've touched on that already. So those moments of truth, some good practice then in hiring the right people remotely would be make it really easy to apply. So don't necessarily think that the only way someone can apply for a job is via a CV. Make it really tough to get in. So you're going to then be the gatekeeper, and make sure that you're practiced and happy to make decisions quickly at that stage. And remember, reputation is everything. So I'm going to move on from those slides that we've already covered and just have a little look at the interview process itself. So at some point you're going to want to do an interview, usually an hour, sometimes slightly shorter, sometimes slightly longer, but typically an hour. And the seven biggest, sort of most common mistakes that I see employers make in an interview would be, again, touching on the same thing we've said about making it easy to apply, really, using the same interview process for every role, or not having a process at all. You know, they'll just meet so and so. So I'd say think carefully about what's appropriate, what would work, and what's really going to let your candidate shine. There's no point asking for a welder to give you his CV. The second one, which feels like I'm doing this today, is doing all the talking. I have been in interviews with line managers where really the balance is off kilter, and they're on broadcast rather than listen. Your job as an interviewer there is really to be a bit of a detective, and you're there to listen and you're there to uncover information. So I'd try and aim, if you can, for an 80-20 balance. Following a script, there was a fashion a few years back, perhaps a little bit OTT, for following very strict scripts. It's slightly fearful, slightly litigious, I think, in terms of why people do it. But recently, and this is a survey I read yesterday that said a huge percentage, 93% of candidates much prefer a guided conversation, but a natural conversation rather than just responding to the dreaded scenario questions. The fourth one is a point that perhaps touches more on psychology than it does on recruitment per se, but if all we're relying on is historic information, we're asking someone to talk through their work history, their CV history, their career to date, then we're actually working on an assumption that past behaviour is a reliable indicator of how they might work in your organisation. And I think we need to perhaps unpack that a little bit and recognise that people thrive in different environments and people thrive in different roles. So how does that impact the interview? I'd be tempted not to get too hung up on the details of how somebody perhaps responded or dealt with a certain situation or went about a certain task in the past. What I'd be tempted to focus on is what they learned from that. So what's the story? What are the trends that are coming out of that conversation that you're having with this individual? What's the overall picture you're getting, not the detail which I know sounds contradictory because I've said the devil's in the detail, but I mean in the process. In terms of interview, I've seen some very competent candidates be rejected for roles because of one or two things they've said, effectively one or two sentences in a 60-minute conversation. And I'm not always sure that the assumption we make about past behaviour is a reliable one. So I'd look for the story and the trends, not the detail. The fifth one is something that some of you may well be aware of anyway, so the idea of unconscious bias and the halo and horns effects. Unconscious bias is I like people who are like me. Halo and horns effect is very similar. A horns effect would be I don't like that person because they remind me of. And a halo effect is I really love them because they remind me of. So you are effectively looking at that individual just as if they had a halo and horns around their head. It's a very dangerous assumption to make, of course, and try and avoid it wherever you can. If you find yourself thinking along those lines, I would almost strike out anything that you've written if you're writing into your notes and you think they're just like so-and-so. That's not to say that you're not looking for similar behaviours, it's just the person that you want to avoid categorising and putting into that box of they remind me of. That said, don't ignore your gut feeling. There's a raft of recruitment, tools and techniques out there about uncovering behaviours and psychometrics, but none of it will replace the gut feeling that you have when you meet somebody. And you will know whether somebody's right for your organisation or not. And often that can get lost later down the line when you're perhaps trying to put together a business case to hire somebody, or you're trying to give them feedback as to why they're not right. If they're not right and they won't fit with your team, then don't ignore that. Don't ignore that. And the seventh one is just that follow-up piece. If you've gone through a process, and at this point you'll be elated because you've found the right person, and it might have taken a little while to find them, and they've accepted your job offer, please do follow it up. Close the loop. Make sure you've done a little bit of referencing, a little bit of Facebook stalking. It doesn't go amiss. If someone chooses to put something out in the public realm, then I think that's fair game. Do check on your professional memberships where you need to, particularly if it's a legal requirement for the job. Do look at background checks. There are some really good organisations that will do this for you. There's one locally to us here in the Humber. They won't charge you a lot, and if you do need to outsource the background checks, please do. But don't trip up at that point by not closing the loop on references and on checks. So moving on from sort of the interview process so much, we're going to talk about onboarding. There's a no man's land for candidates for your potential new employee, and it's a no man's land between the point where they've accepted an opportunity with you but they haven't yet started. They could be working a notice period. It could be anywhere between a week and 3 months, 6 months even, I've seen, but it's a very lonely place to be. They're leaving a team or leaving a work environment or leaving self-employment to come and join your team, but they're not yet part of the organisation, and it's a very, very lonely place, and it's one of these moments of truth. So despite all the good work you've put in, this can be the point where you lose your potential fantastic new person. So the place between offer and start date is really where good onboarding starts. Onboarding does not start on day one, it starts here. So somebody's accepted your offer, hopefully in writing, and they're due to start with you. This is really where onboarding comes into its own, particularly in a remote working situation. Just a quick definition of onboarding in case you haven't come across the term before. Hopefully you have, because it's in the title of the webinar. But really, onboarding is that definition of socialising somebody into your team and your organisation, giving them a positive first experience, helping them to integrate. The faster they integrate, the quicker they're going to do a great job for you. And it's providing a structure in which they can be part of your team. So a week, a month, perhaps a buddy system. The first 12 weeks of any role is the riskiest. So we don't want to break all the good work that you've done at this point, and we want to really set this person up for success in whatever job you've asked them to take on. The first point on that slide was socialising, and I just want to touch on that. How on earth do we socialise someone into a company at a point where we can't actually meet them? And you still might not have met them. And the answer to that is the best you can. So there are lots of ways to do informal meetings online. We know that anyway, but you may have to force these more than you would have than you would normally if we were in a situation where you weren't hiring remotely. So instead of assuming that you can invite somebody to lunch or to drinks in their first week, or they would have a tour and get to meet everybody, you're going to have to organise all that but online. So it's a little bit more effort, it's a little bit more planning, but it's more than possible. And just taking you back to that example I gave before about this organisation in Hull, APD, who do this so well. And they are brilliant at sending video links, walking people around the work environment if they've got one particular department working, but everyone else is remote. Asking people to introduce themselves on little video calls. Yes, there's the quizzes and other things, but we need not to forget that this is this individual's first experience of really what it's like to work within your company and with you. So there are lots of ways to do that, but you do need to plan it a little bit more. Make use of the technology. Don't be afraid to make it very personal. And I would suggest a pub quiz is not, virtual pub quiz is not the right way to do it at first, even if you do that as a team. So think about some structure and give it some thought. I have included on the next slide a checklist for a remote onboarding process, which is something we developed with a customer we were working with recently. So it is, as you'd expect, a checklist, but actually there's some stuff in here that you might not have ever done before if you haven't hired remotely. So we've got things like the telephone calls. Make sure they're assigned a buddy. Good work practice anyway when you join an organisation would be ideally that you always have a buddy. It's not your manager. It's not a mentor either. It's just someone that works at a similar pay grade to you who can show you the ropes and remind you where the loos are if you've forgotten. Definitely going ahead and booking those virtual lunches. So again, a little bit more organisation to get that socialisation going for the first week. Could be with some key people in your organisation. There's some emails. One of the great things I've seen, and you might have seen it, any of you that use LinkedIn, there's some fantastic examples of welcome boxes that go out to people's home addresses. So not just the technology they need to do the job, but actually some good stuff for them as well, whether that be a nice, pen holder for the desk, a mug, a little note, something that comes through as a welcome pack really. They can make a really big difference, something physical, something that's delivered, a bit like a present. Day one starts, make them later, just as you would if someone was joining your organisation. Most people know not to start people at 8:30, just allow for a few unseen delays. Make sure the tech's working first, so the ICT or tech induction first. There's nothing more frustrating than the tech not working. If you have a HR team, then allow for those normal HR inductions to happen, and then let them buddy up with their manager or their buddy throughout week one over tech, but throughout week one, so they've always got somebody, perhaps every 2-3 times a day, somebody you can jump on with and discuss things with, and keep that line of communication really, really open. Normally, of course, when somebody's joined your organisation, you would have some sort of review. Remote is no different, so you might want some sort of feedback session. Often it is run by HR if you're in a larger company, but if it's not, it can be run by a line manager. But really, you want to be chatting at that point to, are we meeting your expectation? Is the job what you expected? Have you now got a good idea of what we expect from you in terms of this month, next month, those sorts of things? There's good conversations to have, usually week 4, month 1. And week 12, which would typically be a probation review, some organisations have it at week 24, but a more formal review of some kind would also perhaps be booked in prior. So it's a good checklist to run through. And gives you some good structure for onboarding somebody remotely. If anyone's got any questions about any of that, please feel free to drop me a line in the chat. I have included here just an idea. I've been asked a couple of times about the idea of a welcome email. So if your offer's gone out, but then you really want to start to integrate the person into your team, this stuff's perhaps a little bit more out there because really it's something that isn't as natural to us in England as it would be perhaps in a culture like America. But the idea really is to make your new employee feel really, really important and special on their first day. And certainly when that's remote, more so, we need that. So there's some ideas on this slide about how to perhaps put together that email. There's some wording that could work. It's really important to just nail the basics of good onboarding, and it's doubly important when you're doing that without actually physically meeting someone. If you make someone feel really important on their first day, they will go beyond the basics for the rest of the time with you because it's an emotional experience. And how someone feels on the first day is a really good indication for how they're going to commit to your organisation. So you really want not just the person who's joining, but for the team to feel excited, to look forward to meeting this person, to working with them. And it's absolutely achievable remotely, 100% achievable remotely. I've also got some good examples of actual emails that have gone out, and I've sort of stolen a couple of phrases there that I thought might help you. So this is the email that would go out to your team to introduce your new hire if they haven't been involved in the process. So I guess from an onboarding point of view, hopefully that's some good pointers. I would say in summary, just make sure that you've considered all the options you need to consider, that you've taken some time, or someone in your organisation has taken some time to really use the checklist and make sure you've got things in place, just as if you were onboarding someone into your organisation physically. It's not much different. The good practice is still good practice. And of course, what we don't want to do is for it all to fall down at this point, having done all this work to find somebody. I'm going to move on from onboarding, and I just want to talk for a moment about keeping it legal. So there are some considerations during hiring that haven't gone away, and this is just a very brief summary of these. So for those of you that already know a little bit about employment law, there's a number of regulations we just need to be aware of. The Employment Rights Act 1996 was updated. There are things now like day one rights, which means that you've already done this if we followed this process. But on day one of their employment, the new employees is entitled to their job description. There are a number of other rights on day one. It's also, when you're designing a recruitment process, it's obviously going to be important to be mindful of the working time regulations. So I've got this written down because it's not something I can always remember, but the maximum working week in the UK is 48 hours. So we do have our exclusion, but 48 hours. Rest breaks for 20 minutes after 6 hours. And if you're looking at a shift pattern, then 11 consecutive hours rest in a 24-hour period. So there are a number of statutory points in how you set up your working week for your new employees. National minimum wage goes up again this year. It's always worth checking, particularly for lower level roles or part-time roles, that you're meeting that. And then the one that always comes up in hiring actually is the Equality Act. So I'm just going to move on to that. Apologies, GDPR first. Let's move on to Equality Act. There we are. Okay. So you've probably all heard the phrase protected characteristics. It's a legal phrase, but these are what they are. So we need to be mindful of any of these within a recruitment process. Typically within the UK, most of us know them, but the one that gets missed is age. So we know that adverts have to be open, have to be inclusive. It's important that we make sure that anybody with a protected characteristic is treated fairly within a recruitment process. The reason I've highlighted age there is I see so many adverts with the number of years experience written on them. Technically, that's not going to work for you in the eyes of the law, I'm afraid. If you're specifying 10 years experience, you are excluding people on the basis of age. So the way around that really is just to say significant experience. You can write your advert in a way that means that only really those people with that level of experience would apply, but I would suggest trying to avoid the number of years on an advert of any kind or on a job description. Just going back to GDPR, obviously you are handling personal data in a hiring process, so it's really important just to be aware of how GDPR works in that scenario. So good employment and hiring practice would mean advise the candidate what data you're collecting and how you're collecting it. Often there are standard statements you can include on any recruitment literature that you're using. You can use it on the bottom of your emails if you choose to use email in your process, but just advise them. Make sure you've got their consent to keep the data, ensure that it's all kept securely. Please don't leave CVs laying around. And that's why emails are great for this. It's actually great in remote hiring. And do ensure that any personal data, sensitive data that you don't need is destroyed after 12 months. And again, that goes back to the idea of getting permission to keep people's details if you want to keep them in your talent pool. Last piece of Employment law is the Agency Workers Act of 2010. It covers, guess what, agency workers. But just to be mindful that they do increasingly need to be treated fairly and equally alongside any permanent employees that you might have. And for those of you who haven't used many agency workers, they've also got the 12-week rule. So the idea of this is really that agency workers who perform the same duties as a permanent member of staff are essentially entitled to a lot of the same sorts of benefits. So yeah, just be aware around the Agency Workers Act. It typically kicks in for contractors, particularly in IT, factories that have seasonal demands. I guess anybody who's a long-term contract as well, just be mindful of that more than anything. If you are using an agency to supply the workers, I would suggest pushing the onus of this back onto the agency and getting them ideally to manage a lot of this for you. They will be aware of it, and they should be, as part of their service, really making you aware of what your rights and responsibilities are. Moving on from the law side of things, I just want to touch on an opportunity. So whenever I say diversity in a recruitment process, I hear a few groans because it's one of those footballs that gets thrown around, doesn't it, politically. Diversity for me is an opportunity, not a barrier, and I just wanted to encourage us all to think about it that way. One of the key ones that gets missed a lot is neurodiversity. So by that I mean someone who perhaps operates outside the cognitive norm. So a couple of phrases you might not have heard before. Cognitive norm means being neurotypical. So that's the person who thinks the way that society expects them to. Neurodivergent means that their thinking and their reasoning are outside that norm. So those might be conditions like ADHD or Asperger's syndrome or dyspraxia or OCD or any of those related syndromes. It's really important that we think about being inclusive, not just because it's the law, but because actually there's a genuine opportunity in this. So it might be that you need to phrase, in terms of being inclusive, phrase your adverts in a really clear way, encourage for people to say if they have non-neurotypical conditions, they'll let you know. Depending on the role, you might need to adapt your process. You might need to change your interview room, particularly if you're in a situation where you're looking to encourage hiring for people with Asperger's or autism, because it can be really overloading for those individuals. And do train your managers, and there are organisations out there that will do this for free for you. The opportunity in neurodiversity I'm going to come on to, but one of the ones I wanted to touch on is autism. So there are about 700,000 people with autism in the UK, and this is a real untapped talent pool. Only 16% of those people are in full-time paid employment. So in terms of an opportunity, there are over 2,000 adults just in Hull alone who could potentially work and probably aren't in employment. Why are we looking at autism? Because actually, in terms of a neurodiverse approach, being autistic comes with superpowers. Autistic people are typically average to above average intelligence. They have very strong short-term and long-term memory skills. They're very direct in how they communicate, very punctual, very honest, very independent thinkers, very detail-orientated. One of the key sectors that we struggle to recruit into in the local market is tech. And if we think a lot about the skills that a developer might need, for example, actually having autism, you'd argue, is a really good superpower for being able to do that job. So that's what I mean when I say there are opportunities in diversity, and perhaps an untapped pool of people that you may not have considered actually come with a whole bunch of skills that you might need. I'm just going to touch previously, there was a slide there that I want to go back to about diversity. I do understand that this again is quite a political hot potato. I'm not going to talk here about sort of, you know, the women's rights movement here at all. All I'm talking about is equality. So the idea that men and women are paid equally and given equal working and promotion opportunities. And I think when we reflect back on the changes that are happening and will come in terms of flexible work, we can see more and more that this will perhaps start to encourage that balance to come into organisations. Some tips for achieving balance then. If you are in tech and engineering, there are some brilliant initiatives out there to think about encouraging women and girls to apply. I would certainly challenge in any literature, your websites, the geeky male stereotype wherever you can. There are lots of mentoring organisations. We sponsor an organisation called Lean In, which is a free organisation mentoring for women in the workplace, actually for men as well. It's for those that believe in equality. Encourage people to rotate roles, you know, promote your companies as family friendly or certainly as remote working friendly. So there's a lot you can do in terms of that gender balance as well. And I suppose if we bring it back to brass tacks, you know, in Yorkshire terminology here, why on earth would you want to do any of this stuff when you've got a business to run? Well, the reason for that is there are numerous studies, and this comes from a study that I read earlier from Harvard, which is the value in a diverse team with maybe neurodiversity included, with equal numbers of men and women, is that it's the capacity to challenge the norm. And if this pandemic has taught us anything, it's that organisations need to challenge the norm. We need to adapt. We need to be resilient. We need to continually be looking over our shoulders about what might change next. And so, actually thinking about diversity in that context is just going to boost that ability of your organisation to adapt in the future, and it will probably improve your decision making. So I think it's a good place to come to when you think about hiring and hiring remotely. Just going to take a pause. I'm conscious that the law stuff is often a little bit dry, so I've really only touched on it at that point, because the last thing I want to do is bore you all 2 hours into a webinar. But I'd certainly encourage you to look at those as opportunity, not barriers. I think in terms of material, I'm very happy to recap on anything we've gone over. But what I was going to encourage at this stage is really any questions you've got, any hiring challenges specifically to remote hiring or onboarding, or hiring challenges generally that I can help with.
Thank you very much, for that one. So yeah, let's we'll have a look at the questions that we've got. So one of the first questions I've got here is, what's your best tips for conducting remote interviews?
Yeah, so we touched on some of the tech stuff before, I guess, in the good practice. One of the things we did recently for one of the roles was, rather than relying on purely a remote interview to assess skills, is we did send out some assessments beforehand. So there was one role we were looking for a programmer, and we'd already sent them a programming challenge. We've just recently hired into a role that involved quite a lot of letter writing, particularly professional letters, and we got them to a letter writing challenge. So that might be worth thinking about before you get onto sort of a webcam. But I'd say test the right things. Please make it appropriate, because I've seen that used too much. And I think the other thing is, going back to the moments of truth idea, is be really transparent from the start about the process and about what you're looking to hire. You know, the ideal person you're looking for. That's probably the best 2 tips I would say about remote hiring, remote interviews.
Thank you very much. The next question I've got is, we are thinking about asking candidates to produce a short, less than a minute film using a mobile phone to tell us how they fit with our values. Have you got any experience in having done this and views about risks or issues?
Yeah, I like the idea. That's the first thing. I think it's different, and I think it does get to the core of it. The risk, I would think, is how much are they going to be able to understand about your values without having sort of been in the company. So it's only ever going to be an impression. So I think you'd be looking probably more for their research and their presentation skills and their ability to do the task than you would the actual answer. I think I would definitely say think about making it fair. Let's check that the candidates have actually got the technology they need, and if not, make it available to them. And if you're thinking about any sort of diversity, then if your candidate pool could include people who perhaps can't use the technology for whatever reason, and just think around it. Could somebody, you know, do the same task for you, but without perhaps using a phone, for example? But I think it's a great idea, and I think the earlier you do that in the process, the more interested. I think you drum up interest, your crowd outside the nightclub first, if you can, and then introduce that as part of your pre-screen. It sounds great. Sounds really good.
The next question I've got is, have you had experience of people questioning equal rights policies prior to interview?
Not many, one or two over the years. It's a funny one, that, isn't it? Because I wonder about why they would need to do that. But again, it comes back to the transparency piece, doesn't it? I've had a couple of people ask me whether, for example, flexible working is offered, or what the maternity policy is, or what the paternity policy is. I've had that one as well. And I guess they're all due diligence questions from a candidate point of view. And if you do happen to have a strict policy on that, then it would, if that's a deal breaker for them, then I think share it. But if you're as transparent as you can possibly be at the beginning, when you're drumming up interest in your opportunity, in your role, if your policy is outlined on your website, for example, which I'd argue it probably should be, then it will already be there. So I'd like to think you could avoid that in the first place. I don't think I'd necessarily have a problem with it. Probably someone who's got lots of attention to detail. If you're looking for an accountant, that's a good question.
The next one is about notice and people taking notice and not being able to work for a long period of time. So it's, yeah, if they're unable to work for a long period of time, can this affect your decision? And are they able to work while on gardening leave?
Okay. The second question is easier than the first. No, somebody can't work while they're on garden leave. Garden leave means somebody is still under contract with their previous employer, and so unless their contract allows it, they would be unable to take on work with any other company. So no, they can't work for you during garden leave. Going back to the first part of that question, would it affect my decision to hire somebody? I'd love to say no, and that in reality we always go with the best available person. But in the real world, yes, it probably would. Garden leave is a tricky situation. I've come across it a lot with sales roles. I have encouraged people on garden leave before to do research, and there's nothing wrong with that. I've encouraged them to think about the market. They can look at SWOT analysis. They can obviously start to familiarise themselves with your business, your organisation, and what you do. But if it's a prolonged period of time, it can be a really tricky thing to manage, absolutely. And it's a very dangerous period as well. It's one of those moments of truth when, you know, all the enthusiasm you have can wane. So it's a really tricky one. And I think anything over 12 weeks becomes quite interesting to manage. Keep in touch with whoever it is. If someone's on garden leave and you choose to hire them, just have a really clear plan to keep in touch with them throughout that process, throughout that period. They can still come to your organisation. They can't work, but they can come to team lunches. They can be, you know, they can start to get to know things online, but they can't actually undertake work.
Are you finding that the notice period is getting longer? It's for various roles now than it was in the past?
Yes, for some roles definitely. Yeah, within tech I'm seeing an increase. It typically used to be 4 weeks. I think anybody, you know, if we think about salary bands, historically anyone who was on perhaps 40k low, so the lower rate taxpayers, a typical notice period would usually be 4 weeks, and it would be unusual perhaps to find anything else. But we're now increasingly seeing 12 weeks plus. I think sometimes that can be challenged, sometimes it can be negotiated. I've offered quite a lot of support to people who perhaps wanted to resign but don't want to, you know, work a notice period of that sort of length. And I think often there is a good argument with the outgoing employer to try and negotiate that. But equally, you know, good employee won't leave an old employer sort of high and dry, in my opinion. And if they're willing to do that, I'd suggest they're probably willing to do it to you too. So I'd always encourage, you know, professional behaviour rather than anything else. But yeah, it is. We are seeing that, and in a region like ours where we're low on skilled talent, I think we're gonna see more of that trend.
Next one's along a similar sort of lines, and it's quite an interesting one actually. Do you have to give time off for interviews?
No, absolutely not. No, that's a really interesting. The only situation where you would perhaps be legally have to give time off is perhaps if you're in a redundancy situation, which would, I'd say, be the human thing to do, but also under a consultation period, you would need to give people some opportunity to look around for new work. But no, absolutely, you're not obliged in any other situation to give time off for interviews.
Yeah, as you say, I think a very interesting one of how you deal with that as an employee as well as an employer in some respects.
Yeah, something's gone really, it's either a very, very honest relationship or something's gone really wrong. I'm not sure which.
Yeah, certainly polar opposites there, I think, isn't it?
Yeah, definitely. So.
Yeah. Let me just have a look, make sure we've answered all the questions that we've got. So yeah, I think that's all the questions that have come through on the chat today. So yeah, Kate, unless you've got anything else.
Something else just occurred to me about the first question, which was about some tips, wasn't it, about remote hiring generally. For those organisations that don't do this, there's a piece of software called DocuSign, and I forgot to mention that we use it quite a bit. So when you're ready to make an offer, you can automate all that paperwork via DocuSign, and it's free and it's very simple to do. So there's often a lot of hiring documentation with new hires. There'll be perhaps a contract and there might be some policies and things like that. And lots of people don't have printers and scanners at home, and it can frankly be a pain. So I'd just say to automate that wherever you can. Just use DocuSign. It's really straightforward.
Do you say that was a free software, is it, or?
Yeah, free tool. Obviously, like most software, there's paid plans, but the DocuSign basic account is free. So yeah, absolutely.
It's very useful to know. Well, thank you very much, Kate.
You're welcome. I think it's early, which is always good.
Yeah. Some very useful information there, and hopefully everybody's taken some really good pointers and tips away from that. I certainly have myself. I'd also like to thank everybody for attending today's workshop. As normal, this will be available on the Humber Growth Hub website in the coming days, so you will be able to review this going forward. As I say, there are other events we've got running. Next week, we are running one on the returning back to work after COVID and being COVID secure. And there are a number of other workshops available. So if you want to visit the humbergrowthhub.org /events, you should be able to see all the available workshops on all the different subjects, and they're all free to attend in the same way as this one. Also, if anybody would like to access any follow-up one-to-one support, please, again, do get in contact with the Humber Growth Hub. Details are on the screen, and say the website address is humbergrowthhub.org. So final thing for me to do is just to, again, thank Kate for giving such a useful and informative workshop today. And just say thank everybody for attending today's course. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Peter. Thanks very much. Have a good day, everyone.